Welcome to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Elizabeth Bryant. Dr. Elizabeth has her Ph.D. from the University of South Florida, and she's published several books on our topic today, which is writing and the teaching of writing. Her books include Grading in the Post-Process Classroom, Voice as Process, and Essays on Writing. She writes and teaches about writing with a focus on how we learn to write and the best ways to teach writing. She's an associate professor at Purdue University Northwest. Elizabeth, we've been teaching writing since, I don't know, the pencil I think was invented during Plato and Aristotle's time, right? Mm-hmm. Started out as a teaching of rhetoric. It's evolved, and it's evolved quite a bit since you and I have been at the university.
Yep.
How's this changed since you started as a teacher or as a writer even?
As a writer. When I started, when I started in college, let's start before that. Let's start with high school.
Sure.
And I was, this is a good story. I like to tell this story about how I began as a writer. I was in the 11th grade, and there was Mrs. Caldwell. And we had read some poetry, and we had written about it. And Mrs. Caldwell sort of had this beehive hairdo. This dates me a little bit.
Yes.
And she had this really...
You're dating this.
I know I
yes,
am.
Okay.
Skirt that goes out.
Yeah.
And she walked down the hall past me, and she said, "Liz, if you're going to college, you need to learn how to write." I grew up in Virginia, and from that point on, I was so afraid of writing that I stayed as far away from it as I could. And because she told me that I didn't know how to do that. I'd spent a lot of time reading. I was really good at reading. So when I finally did get to college, I started with a history course. And Dr. Hari, I will never forget, said to me, he said, "Liz, you should take writing." And I said, "Dr. Hari, I don't want to take writing. I'm not good at it." And he said, "Okay, I have somebody that's really good for you." So I started at the community college and with Dr. Gottschalk.
Yeah.
And she showed me that you can teach people how to write. Because what I thought was that it was just something you automatically knew how to do.
Yeah.
And
I think a lot of our students think that, don't they? Yeah.
right. And
They're either good at it or they're not.
they're not.
They
And
don't
that
have
there's
it.
some magical power that you get, like Hemingway or
Yeah.
a wonderful poet like Emily Dickinson. And if you don't have that, you can't get it.
Right.
And so I spend a lot of time educating people about writing, and that you have to practice it to get better.
Right. So that's an interesting aspect of this. So to some extent, it seems to me, what do you think? It seems like the piano. You know, some people may not have a lot of musical talent, but they can practice long enough and they can play the piano and be pretty good at it. Some people just have some talent that they're born with, and they figure it out, and they write wonderful pieces and they play beautifully. But it doesn't mean that if you don't have that talent that you can't also
Become a competent writer.
Yeah.
And I think there's a difference between being, like I said, a Hemingway who has wonderful images, and being able to use writing in your life. Right?
Right.
I think writing is like joining a conversation. If you want to tell somebody something, being able to write is one of those ways you can do it.
Right.
And a lot of people use editorials to write, and writing is about thinking. And if you can think, you can learn to write. And it's a wonderful thing, because you get to tell the world what you want to say, and you can begin to change the world. Writing has changed our world. This example recently, just 3 simple words.
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter. Somebody put that down somewhere, and it's had a lot of impact on the world.
Yeah. Well, so let's look at the methodologies here for a minute.
Okay.
So my first college English class was spring of 1972 at Joliet Junior College.
Yeah.
And they were using the modes, what they called the modes. So your first essay maybe was description, and you graduated to, I don't know.
Classification.
Classification, good. Comparison, contrast.
Process
was one
analysis.
Of them. Process analysis.
Right.
And then you finished with an argumentation paper, as I recall. But I think we had 10 essays, half of which we wrote in class and half of which we wrote at home and had to have typed up. I had an F for the last English class I took in high school before I dropped out, right?
Oh.
So I got a GED diploma and I signed up for this English class in college just to see what would happen. It was the only class I signed up for. Didn't plan to get a degree, just wanted to take a class. And at the end of the semester, the professor read my essay to me. He said, "This essay is so good I have to read it at the class." He read my essay. So why did that work so well for me? Those modes.
Those modes.
And we've abandoned them. We don't use them anymore.
Well, what I think, one of the ways that we learned to write is by reading.
Yeah.
And if you read a lot, you pick up sentence patterns,
Yeah.
and you pick up vocabulary, right? And that's something that isn't sort of taught, it's sort of learned by reading. And I suspect you read a fair amount.
Well, you know, you're right. For a high school dropout, I was subscribing to Psychology Today and
Okay.
Time Magazine and
And those
Yeah.
modes, which you went on to study,
read The Life of Freud. I was a very eclectic reader.
oh, so you read a lot of different kinds of things.
And then I took that class, so maybe I self-taught. I don't know.
You self-taught a little bit, and those modes, the modes that we talk about teaching are modes of thinking and modes of writing, but typical kind of genres we write today are filled with those kinds of things. So you might write a piece where there's some narrative and there's some analysis and there's some argument.
Of course.
So what we did, so we divided them up, thinking that that would be easier, right? And then sort of rethinking it a little bit, we thought, maybe we should go back and think about the aims of writing. So we went through a period where the textbooks sort of took on the aims mode. So one of the aims is to inform. Another aim is to argue. Another aim is to sort of make people think. Those different kinds of things. So we've had textbooks for a while now that sort of you write a narrative, right?
Right.
And a larger narrative, and it has different parts in it. And you write some informative pieces by looking at the aim of the piece of writing rather than the mode that's used in it.
And do you think that's more effective?
No, I think this is what I think is more
Okay.
effective. So we went from that. Now we're moving to writing what we call genres, I think.
Okay.
In terms of teaching students the different types of genres that they will encounter. And sort of so that we talk to them about what a genre is and how it operates. Now I can talk about.
So for example?
So for example, a text message. They used to be only certain number of words long, right? And they know that. And then I take and talk about, okay, there's these other genres. We don't use them a lot anymore, but letters. We use genres in terms of reviews, a lot of reviews with evaluation in them. And we use a lot of reports and proposals. Some newer genre these days are white papers. And so within that structure of the course, we're still teaching a lot of the same things. Like writing happens as a process.
Right.
Writing is thinking. How do you think? So even though the overall structure of the course looks like it's changed,
Yeah.
the underlying factors in a writing course pretty much are still the same.
Well, just to stay with that, the old rhetorical
Okay.
method for a second, I'm just curious. One of the things that that the ancient teachers of rhetoric said was that they weren't really just teaching people how to speak or how to write, but they were teaching them how to think.
How to think.
And they believed that if somebody had muddled words to say, right, if they weren't clear when they were speaking, that it wasn't that they just didn't know how to speak, it was that they didn't know how to think. And that if they learned how to speak more clearly, they'd also learn how to think more clearly. How do you feel about that?
That makes total sense to me. And the fact that we take it a step further so that in the process of teaching people to write, the speaking translates into the writing, and at first writing is jumbled, right?
Yeah.
So that in writing courses we do a lot of what we call unfinished writing. So rather than writing perfect pieces that go very well, we'll write some journals or we'll do some double entry research logs where the students practice the thinking and the writing in the text. and we have different drafts, right?
Because it's a different
mindset,
right?
Right,
Yeah.
and a lot of students who don't like writing get frustrated with it. So, so talking about, it doesn't have to be perfect the first time. Talking about your ideas have to grow, and telling them it's just as much about thinking as it is about the practice of writing.
So if someone's struggling with their writing, they might try that as a approach just on their own. Just try getting out what they want to say and not worried about, don't worry about what it looks like.
What it looks like, or
and
the
see
errors.
that as a second
step.
Second, maybe not even a second step, just a completely different thing to do, essentially, right? But what about these writers who said that they never edited the beat poets, and Jack Kerouac, who claims that he wrote On the Road on a scroll of paper and just typed it out? Did he do that? Do you believe that?
No, I don't believe he did that. I think, I believe, I call them back burner writers, and I sort of point to the back of their head and I said, do you think about all this before you write it down? And they say yes. And then they sort of transcribe it. So I think we can do some of that, right? Especially with memos and more emails. So I can craft an email in my head. I can't craft a chapter or a book in my head. So I think maybe some writers do that, but more in shorter pieces than longer pieces. And Kerouac was a interesting character, wasn't he?
Yes, he was in a lot of ways. And then look at some of the lengthy things that people wrote. I mean, Melville writing Moby Dick. I wish I could be looking over his shoulder
He does that.
when he was doing that. There's just so much there. That writing is so rich. I can't imagine that he. It looks so well crafted, but it's just so well put together. It's almost as if I think maybe he didn't edit it, because if he were editing it, it would be just too complicated. It would be too hard to do.
Too hard to read, yeah.
Yeah. Are some people so talented, do you think, that just...
I think the more you
flows out?
practice it and the more you do it, and the more you read. One of the authors I've looked at some is Hemingway, and how he would rewrite the ending of a novel or a short story up to 100 times, right?
Yeah. Okay, we are going to take a quick break. The Calumet Roundtable will be right back. You were on the air at WXRT, I think, the day John Lennon died, right?
Yeah, I was.
And that was during your broadcast, am I right?
It was, but it was a specialized broadcast called This Week in Chicago.
One of the things that was noted when you look across the country, that Chicago has a much higher incidence of police shootings than others. So let me ask you this, is it because Chicago is a more violent community? Does Chicago have more people that confront police in a way that's not done the same way in New York or LA?
Do you think you look at things differently than other musicians because of your own experience?
One of the beauties is people say conductors live because they're doing this all the time.
Yeah.
I think conductors live a long time because you're just growing.
Welcome back to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. My guest today, Dr. Elizabeth Bryant, and I are talking about writing and teaching writing, something that's become an issue more and more because people feel that digital media, television, things like that are distracting us. They're rotting our brains. So I'd like to explore maybe a little bit what the differences are, and how well are we doing as universities and high schools at teaching people to write, and are we getting to the point where this is going to be a lost art for the average person? So, so maybe we could just start with the digital media. Do you have any thoughts on what you think the impact of that is?
One of the things that I've noticed, and I've read a lot in about our research, is they're saying that young people do a little bit more writing now with text messaging than they used to do. And
So there might actually be a bit of an advantage to
there's a bit of an
letting your
advantage there.
kids text message all day long. Yes.
But if they only do it in blocks of 30 characters or short blocks,
Yeah.
then the depth of their thinking and writing abilities is not as good as we would like it to be.
They write well, but they're stupid.
No, I don't want to say they're stupid.
Okay.
But we you know, their thinking is not as advanced, and so it doesn't show up in what they write.
Okay.
Okay. That's what I'm finding a little more of, and I think that. But I look around and I see lots of different people reading. Every once in a while, I'll go to an elementary school and I see these kids reading, and so I'm not sure exactly what's happening. I see that sometimes we depend more on the screen,
Yeah.
and we depend more on the spell check to help us,
Right.
and I'll see words that were submitted in for other words that don't make any sense. I see more and more students just not liking writing. They come in and they'd say, I don't like it. So I sat down with them and I asked them why. And they say, I'm just not good at it. And I said, well, why do you think you're not good at it? And they said, well, I got all my papers marked up and I didn't get good grades. And so what I do with them is I sort of re-educate them a little bit. And we talk about writing and thinking. And
Yeah.
the other problem with it, I think writing is thinking. And if you're not thinking, it shows on the page.
Well, and this was what the rhetoric teachers in ancient times believed too, right? I mean, that there really wasn't a difference. What we're doing right now with one another, we do in our minds when we're trying to think something through, right?
And there's
Everything's
some
a dialogue.
wonderful theorists who have theorized that and talk about how we externalize that to the page, right? And
Yeah.
so in writing classes these days, we're trying to teach a little more reading because that's where you pick up good ideas. We teach a lot of synthesis and evaluation, and what you were talking about, the rhetoricians, sort of like, and we take that and we put those into genres and aims and have students write and write and write and revise and revise and revise. And I think with technology, they just want it to happen really quickly.
So the writing class at the university, the freshman writing class, usually it's 2 classes, I think, on most campuses.
Most campuses, yes, sir.
Does that get students ready for the rest of their college career, or do they need something beyond that? What do you think?
I think in the research that we've done,
Yeah.
it shows that students coming in really need at least the first semester. Right? The first semester where they get inculcated in to academic work, right?
Yeah.
And sort of things like how to write summaries, those kinds of things, and learning that kind of stuff. The second semester, which usually focuses on some research and some other documents, some universities have moved it to the second year, which gives students a little bit of time to see why they might need to learn to write arguments. So, and then a lot of universities also have what we call a writing in the disciplines course at the 3rd or 4th year.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to teach a brand new student what they need to learn with writing for the rest of their career. Because as they move into psych or as they move into sociology, in engineering, the basic parts are there, but the different genres that they'll learn, and they need support all the way through.
And do you believe that we're always learning, always getting better at writing? Do you think we peak at some point?
I think we're always getting better, and we're always having to adapt when we get to a certain phase in our life. So when someone sits down to write their first textbook or sits down to write a letter to our new president, and they've never written a letter like that before, what happens is
They need to tweet if they want to reach him, I think.
Oh, that's right, I forgot about that. Oh, okay, so tweets. So they have to come up with 20 letters that they can do to tweet, okay. Oh,
Anyway.
that's not going to help their writing much, is it? Okay, all right. Okay.
So what about writing classes for people in the workplace, you know, that's been experimented with.
Experimented with, you know, and support.
Is that fruitful?
Yeah, I think so. When I had finished my master's, I did some editing in a business, and it was sort of interesting to work with people and their text.
Yeah.
Sometimes we need somebody else to read our text.
Yeah.
When we're too close to the text, we know what's supposed to be there.
Yeah.
I can work with students who will go ahead and insert a word even when it's not on the text. As human beings, I think we always need somebody to read our text and help us think. Wonderful tutors and supporters and teachers like that. Yeah.
And there's a maturity factor here too, right? What happens at age 20? What's the difference about learning writing after age 20 and learning before that, approximately?
Well, our frontal lobe, they're telling us with all the new MRIs, isn't developed until their early 20s. So that part of our brain, which helps us to think and project, is not always there if we get a 16 or a 17-year-old. 16 or 17-year-old. And what we're doing a lot is in that time period, we are teaching them how to think, in addition to teaching them how to write. Mm-hmm. So I don't think sometimes we can expect them to have wonderful insights all the time.
So these programs like dual credit, for instance, which are moving some of the freshman classes down into the high schools, are actually giving students speech classes that they normally would have taken freshman, sophomore year, and writing classes that they would have taken, you know, at later years when they're still 17.
Yeah, 16 and 17.
16, 17.
Some places they're even giving them to sophomores. And
So you're saying even if it's a smart student, even if the student's diligent, the potential is diminished because of the maturity factor.
The maturity factor in the brain. And so what happens is the ability to talk about issues is diminished if there are things that parents don't want. I believe that a college class is taught by a college teacher at a college. And we can try to move them back to high school, but it's very difficult to do that. And
So what are some of the differences? College class, college curriculum, college instructor, how's that different?
I taught high school.
Yeah.
And the students would come in, oh, this is another good story. The last period of the day were the juniors. They would come in, they'd been out playing, and they would come in and they would sit down and they would complain. I don't like to write, we can't do this. So there's, between that high school and college year is a maturity, right? So in high school, I couldn't ask them to leave. In college, if they're not being mature and they're not doing their work, I can ask them to leave if we have difficulties, right? The thing is that it takes time to learn and it takes time to grow. And my fear is that if we give these teachers, if we give the students these courses that about reading and writing and thinking, which is, you know, which communication is, and writing and math, too early, they don't get it when they come to college, and they're not getting the experience they need of the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, one other issue that I wanted to bring up if we have time here, and I think it's not something that's talked about, but it's sort of the opposite of where we've been going with these other issues. And it has to do with what influence has the writing for the digital media had on formal writing. So just as an example, and maybe not, but I'd like to know what you think about this. 1066, Norman conquest of England, right? French becomes the official language in England. And so pretty much everything that's written, all of the discussions in court, it's all in French. It's a couple hundred years before English resurfaces. When it does, it's evolved, it's gone crazy, right? There's all these, there's new words, there's new ways to construct sentences. And what we call early modern English emerges, right? Do you think that something like that is happening right now because of all of the unstructured, uninhibited writing that people are doing through digital media, through their texting and their email messages and things. And do you think that we're developing writing habits, and maybe some of them good ones, right? Writing techniques, changes to the language that are sort of evolving back from the digital experience back into formal English.
Right. I think everything that happens in our culture impacts what we write and sentence structure and that kind of stuff. What I've been noticing a lot in more text, a lot of use of dashes.
Yeah.
And so where you know, in the Chicago
That's the
manuals,
influence of Emily Dickinson.
Emily
though,
Dickinson.
right?
Well,
No, just
that
kidding.
was, yeah.
But anyway,
it
go ahead,
dashes,
yeah.
it dashes, and a lot of dashes. So I'll read these texts online.
Yeah.
They're full of dashes. And what the Chicago Manual of Style says, you should use a colon here. So I think that our language evolves. It just evolves naturally, right? And it just does, because we're humans, right? We have new words. I was talking the other day, I like text.
Yeah.
Text has moved to a verb. What's the past tense of to text?
Yeah, text.
I don't know. Texted.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound right to me. So we're always forming and shaping new languages, and I think it is evolving. And
But so it's maybe evolving at a more accelerated rate because it's so unconstrained, right?
unconstrained and formal and informal prose, right? And so you might go back and read an article in a newspaper.
Yeah.
But
Well, and I just to kind of wrap things up, when a faculty member said to me when we were talking about doing this show, you know, have you had someone put LOL in an essay yet, right? So hopefully that's not going to become part of acceptable formal English, but an interesting development. All right, that's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Liz Bryant for joining me today on the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. Have a great day.